All right, let's dive in. Today we're breaking down a postmortem of a really fascinating philosophical debate between two major worldviews. Now, we're not going to rehash the debate itself. Instead, we're looking at one author's deep analysis of the arguments, the tactics, and, the final logical score. So, how exactly do you defend a logical paradox? Well, let's break down the strategy. Right at the heart of this whole thing is one single profound question. One God, three persons. Sounds simple enough, right? But how do you actually count that without tripping over a logical contradiction? This little puzzle, this was the central battlefield for the entire debate. So think of this as our post-game analysis. We're not here to pick a winner, we're just going through the source articles play-by-play of all the logical moves made by Dr. Joshua Sijuwade and Jake Brancatella. Let's see how their arguments really held up under pressure.
This slide just boils the whole conflict down to a math problem, doesn't it? On one side, you've got tawhid, the Islamic idea of God's unity. 1 equals 1. Pretty straightforward. But on the other side, you have the Christian Trinity. 1 equals 3. And right there, in that simple equation, that's the seed of this huge logical challenge. These are the two opposing teams in this philosophical game.
And that leads us right to the main event. What the source article says is the absolute core issue, the central counting problem. This isn't just about theology, it's about pure logic and identity. How can three distinct someones also be just one someone?
So let's get specific. The official name for this puzzle is the logical problem of the Trinity, or LPT. The big challenge for Dr. Sijuwade was this. How do you say there is only one God when you also say there are three distinct persons, and that each one of them is God? It really feels like you're saying 1 + 1 + 1 = 1, and that's the puzzle he had to solve.
So facing that challenge, Dr. Sijuwade put forward a really specific defense. And according to the analysis we're looking at, his strategy wasn't to change the reality of it, but to get really clear on the language we use to talk about it. It was a defense built entirely on words.
Here's the model he laid out. He argued that the title, the one God, refers only to the Father. Now, the Son and the Spirit, they are still fully divine, no question, but they just don't hold that specific title. The really crucial move here is that this creates two completely different jobs for the word God, all depending on how you're using it.
Let's break that down, because this is key. First, there's a nominal sense. Think of God as a proper name, like Steve or Zeus. In this sense, it only refers to the Father. But then there's the predicative sense. Here, think of God like an adjective, a description, like powerful or divine. In this sense, it can apply to all three persons. So you've got one name and one description. So what does this all boil down to? It's basically a grammar rule. Dr. Sijuwade's argument was that to avoid that messy counting problem, whenever you're talking about the three persons together, you should only use God in that first sense, the name that refers only to the Father. It's essentially a stylistic rule. Okay, so that's the defense. A pretty clever linguistic strategy, right? But did it work? Let's get to the analysis of the counterattack and see how Jake Brancatella responded, because according to the source, this is where the whole debate really turned.
And this, right here, is the heart of the counterargument. Jake's point was simple but powerful. Creating a rule book for language doesn't change the facts on the ground. Just telling people not to count something doesn't change the reality of what's actually there to be counted.
And you can see why this was such a killer move, right? It totally refocused the entire conversation. The source argues it dragged the debate away from being about a style guide for words and slammed it right back where it started, as a hard, cold problem of metaphysics and logic. Because the problem never really went away. Even if you agree to follow the language rule, you've already admitted that in that descriptive sense, you have three distinct persons who are fully divine. The counting problem is still there. It's just kind of hiding behind a rule about when you're allowed to say the word God.
And this is where another flag gets thrown on the play. The issue was Aseity, which is just a fancy word for self-existence. Dr. Sijuwade argued that only the Father has this quality. But the critique, as the source points out, was that this felt like moving the goalposts. It looked like he was changing the very definition of fully God just to make his model work, and that really weakened his case.
Now, as they say, the best defense is a good offense. Dr. Sijuwade didn't just play defense. He also launched a couple of his own attacks on the Islamic model of tawhid. Let's take a look at how the analysis says those were handled.
So here were his two main offensive plays. First up, the divine modesty argument, that a truly great God wouldn't be so self-referential. And second, the historical continuity argument, that Islam's strict monotheism was actually a break from earlier Abrahamic religions. Well, according to the source, this first attack just didn't land. The counterargument was basically twofold. First, who says modesty is a required attribute for God in the first place? And second, in the Trinity, the Father honors the Son, which is still God honoring God. So the argument either didn't apply or it kind of boomeranged back on his own position.
And the second attack was also deflected with another smart linguistic clarification. Jake argued that the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, is primarily about who is worthy of worship. It's not a statement about ontology, the nature of being. By reframing Islam's core claim this way, it really blunted the argument that there was some kind of historical break.
All right, so we've seen the defense, the counterattack, and the offense. After analyzing all of that, the source material comes to a pretty clear conclusion. Let's take a look at the author's final scorecard for this whole debate.
So when it comes to pure debate strategy, the analysis points out 3 areas where Jake really had the upper hand. He kept his own burden of proof super light, he controlled the definitions by constantly demanding clarity, and, this was huge, he got that key concession about the descriptive use of the word God, which became the foundation for his entire critique.
And this scorecard from the source article? Wow, it's pretty much the final whistle. On every single key issue, from the core counting problem all the way to the arguments on aseity and divine modesty, the analysis concludes that Jake's relentless logical pressure found the weak spot in the defense, giving him the win on every point.
So at the end of the day, the big takeaway from this postmortem is this. This wasn't about who was a better speaker or who was more persuasive. The victory here was decided purely on the internal consistency and logical rigor of the arguments themselves.
And all of this leaves us with this one massive final question. Can a rule about language, a style guide for words, ever truly solve a deep, fundamental problem about the nature of reality itself? The analysis we've just walked through seems to suggest it can't. And that leaves us all to ponder the limits of our language when we're faced with the ultimate questions.
قل إن كنتم تحبون الله قل إن كنتم تحبون الله فاتبعوني يحببكم الله قل إن كنتم تحبون الله فاتبعوني يحببكم الله فاتبعوني يحببكم الله ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم والله غفور رحيم قل